All right, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is Rachel Gregory, your host, and I'm here with Bryan Boorstein. What's up, Bryan?
Yo, what's up, Rachel? So glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. We were chatting off air about how we kind of crossed paths a few years ago, sort of through your training. I had moved to San Diego back in 2017, and I messaged you on Instagram asking about your new evolved training plan because I think that had just come out around then, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Correct,
So I was kind of transitioning away from CrossFit, but then I went back. So it was just a funny story. And then when I looked to message you on Instagram, I saw that message from 2017 or 2018. So weird. Small world.
Yeah, we can't hide from technology. They know everything.
Yeah, it's funny. All right. So before we get started, there's a few topics I want to chat about today, get your kind of expertise on. Do you want to just give us, because I know you've been you've had an incredible story through the fitness industry. And I want to kind of dive into that a little bit. So do you want to just kind of, you can go as long as you want, but just kind of tell us how you got started in fitness and give us a little background to basically how you got to where you are today.
For sure. Yeah. As a little 15-year-old boy, prepubescent, just trying to make it on the varsity basketball squad, trying not to get beat up by kids at school, and, a little bit of that. And my vision, if I could know when I was 15 to look forward and be on this podcast with you and have you just say you've had an incredible journey through the fitness industry, that would have been my dream come true at 15, right? So this guy stumbles across the weight room at 15, just trying to get a little bit stronger, be a little bit more manly, in a boy's body at the time. And that's where it all began. I was lucky enough that the first information I found back in 1997 was not picking up a Flex magazine on the magazine stands or anything like that. I actually stumbled into a couple forums online. It was super fledgling internet at the time. But they were kind of HIIT, which is not high intensity interval training, but high intensity training. It's kind of its own methodology of training program design. And they focus on abbreviated training where effort and intensity are the primary factors versus volume. It's a bit contrarian to, the current evidence-based space where, 10 to 20 sets and make sure you're hitting your volume and you don't need to go to failure, and kind of a lot of the pieces that we follow today. But at that time, it was amazing for me because this group of guys that I found online, they advised me to basically pick 3 compound movements on a Monday and 3 compound movements on a Thursday and just work them as hard as I can, working out twice a week. So it'd be a leg or a hip movement, a push and a pull. And you would do that on Monday, and then you choose different 3 movements and do the same kind of full body routine on Thursday. It was a mix of 1 or 2 sets to failure in the 8 to 15 range. And then some of it was 5 by 5, just kind of strength based or hypertrophy based, doesn't really matter, all through the different rep ranges. And that was really, really great for me. I couldn't imagine that I would be at the same place that I am now if the first thing that I stumbled across was Flex magazines, and suddenly I'm doing 25 sets of chest on Monday and 30 sets of back on Tuesday, and also trying to be a teenager and play basketball, and do all these other things that I want to do. So I'm just so thankful that that's where I started. And then through the years, I kind of just grew an obsession. I know there's a bit of a selection bias when you are somebody that enjoys the weight room. You probably are somebody that also gets relatively decent results, because if you just showed up into the weight room and nothing was happening, I don't know how long you would do that, but I wouldn't do it that long. So I got some decent results pretty quickly, and people started to notice. And, it all kind of coincided with the same time that I was hitting puberty. So I graduated high school at 5'10", 170, and I was pretty lean. I think I actually probably held back some of my potential results because I was in this bodybuilding world where everything was 6 small meals a day. And like literally a meal for me would be like 4 ounces of turkey and like a quarter cup of rice and like a piece of fruit or something like that. And that's what I did like 6 times a day. So I probably was underfed, considering I was a teenager going through puberty and playing basketball and lifting weights and doing all these things. So when I got to college, we had, all the food you could eat in the cafeteria. And in the first 4 months of college, I went from 170 to 200, 30 pounds in 4 months.
Wow.
Definitely not all muscle, but a lot more muscle than, I would expect to gain now if I gain 30 pounds, that's for sure. So I ended up at about 200 pounds at that point. And that's more or less where I've hovered around for the next 15 years after that. It's just kind of been a process of like down 10 pounds, build back up to like 200, down 10 pounds, build back up to 200. And every time that I go down 10 pounds, I'm like just trying to make it a little bit better than the previous 10 pounds. So that all kind of continued through college, post-college. And then in 2010, my college roommate, he and I, Anders Varner, you probably know of him. He hosts the Barbell Shrug podcast. We started CrossFit PB in 2010, did the whole CrossFit thing, competed in CrossFit, coached CrossFit, started online coaching because of CrossFit. It was quite an experience for a number of years, something super positive that then sort of began to turn negative over the course of time. And we can kind of delve into that as we go through the discussion more. And popped out the other side of CrossFit in like 2016. As you kind of mentioned earlier, I started Evolve Training Systems as my kind of meandering path away from CrossFit and into more of like a pure physique pursuit. So the original Evolved programs were like kind of my version of a hybrid of CrossFit and bodybuilding, where I wouldn't really have any like kipping movements or anything that wasn't sustainable long-term, but there would be, Metcon conditioning sequences thrown in with like a little bit of Olympic lifting and stuff like that, but with still kind of the main focus on physique or bodybuilding pursuits. And then that turned in a year later into me starting a more pure physique program. And then 2 months later, I started Physique Globo, which is physique for commercial gyms with like hack squats and hammer strength machines and things like that. So those kind of became my programs. In 2018, I started Paragon Training Methods with Laurie Christine King. And it's a lot, it's very similar in many ways to what Evolve does. But what I like to kind of think about it as is Evolved is kind of my creative outlet where I can try new things, maybe things that haven't been proven or things that maybe I haven't even tried yet, but ideas that I have, and I can get feedback from people on how they're going in like a very small sample size, because Evolved is significantly smaller than the community at Paragon. And then Paragon has coaches in the Facebook group that help people with feedback. And there's like this constant community feel to Paragon, whereas Evolved is just kind of like this opportunity for me to create and test, and almost like my science lab of sorts. So that's when people ask me kind of the difference in the programs, because the programming is relatively similar. That's kind of the way I describe it now. And that more or less takes us to the current.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, I went through your Evolve program. I think I was doing it for like 2 months and I loved it. And that was right when I came back to San Diego. But I actually like wanted to get back into cross a little bit because I was missing the kind of atmosphere vibe. So I like tried out a Globo gym for a few months, wasn't really feeling it, went back to CrossFit. And then I ended up going out of CrossFit again because I wasn't getting the results I wanted. I got injured. And so I ended up hiring my own coach and going off of program with him. But I loved, everything about your programming. I think it was a really great blend of kind of CrossFit style, but like you said, more bodybuilding. So in terms of CrossFit, I'm just curious, like what have you seen, or I guess first, before I go into this question, what kind of started the negative? Because I know you mentioned the negative side kind of came out of CrossFit. What was there something specific that started that, or?
To be honest, it's funny that it comes down to this, but in 2015, I signed up for a men's physique competition, which is, unrelated to CrossFit, but it was within like the meat of my time in CrossFit. And the reason I did that is because Anders and I had decided to branch out of being just CrossFit. We had 2 gyms at the time. And we decided to turn one of the locations into more of like a physique bodybuilding style, like specialty classes. We also had like Oli classes and other stuff like that, but it was more like specialty stuff. And then the other gym, the original one, was just going to be like pure CrossFit all the time. So we figured, as the poster boy and the person programming this new bodybuilding class that we were going to do, that I should totally do a men's physique show, get some cool pictures and use them as part of the promotion. I knew nothing about the physique world at that time. I was so deep in CrossFit. So at about the 6-week out mark, I prepped myself up until 6 weeks. And then at 6 weeks, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I should probably hire like a professional to help me out here. And I went to the local gym in San Diego, the gym. You remember the gym, the bodybuilding gym, the Mecca. And I just hired like the local coach that was there, that was available. And I didn't even think at the time that there might be a difference in the way that you would prep somebody that's natural versus somebody that's enhanced. And, you know, if you know the gym in San Diego, you know that almost everyone that goes there is enhanced, which I didn't even think about at the time. Like, I was just so unaware of it. And so this coach prepped me and it was awful. He cut like sodium and water and slashed calories really low and upped my cardio and did like all these things that now in the evidence-based space, I understand why I felt so awful coming out of it. But I finished that competition in June of 2015 and felt so terrible, so depleted and so run down and so weak. And I actually got my testosterone checked and it was under 150, with normal range being like 400 to 1200. So that's where I was standing after that competition. And so it was that almost as the catalyst. Like, I was already kind of burning out on CrossFit because I even had this idea like, hey, we're going to start this bodybuilding program. I'm going to do this men's physique comp. I was kind of wavering a little bit. And then when that happened, I just couldn't imagine going back to CrossFit. Like, after feeling that depleted, I couldn't imagine doing a WOD or like even having the aggression and the drive to put my body and my mind through the type of pain that I knew was what I would have to do to get back to being good at CrossFit again. So I actually went back to my roots and did exactly the type of training that I did when I was 15, when I first started. And I met those guys in the internet forum, basically 2 times a week, full body. And it took me 6 full months of doing that before my testosterone returned to normal. And I felt like a glimmer of hope again in my life. It was December or January. So that year, the Open was going to be, in March, as it was for CrossFit. And I decided, all right, I'm starting to feel better. It's January 2016. Let's do this thing. And I started ramping up my CrossFit training, getting back into Oli work, doing all these things. And it wasn't like I had one really bad injury, but I had a series of like, I tweaked my knee doing this, or I tweaked my groin catching a snatch, or I hurt my shoulder doing a butterfly pull-up, and these like little nagging things that just kept setting me back. And on top of that, I just didn't enjoy the feeling of metconning anymore. Like, I found myself looking for excuses and ways to pace workouts so that I wouldn't have to hurt as bad. And I don't know, it just, around the same time as well, Anders and I started, as we both became more disillusioned with CrossFit, we started having quibbles about what direction to take the gym. And he was starting to get a lot more into the world of rehab. He started working with Teresa Larson at Movement RX, and really wanted to help people feel better versus making people feel like shit every day. And I wasn't sure what direction to take it, but I knew that I had more of this kind of returning passion for physique pursuits. And we split ways at that point, sold the majority of our shares in the gym. And that's, a blessing in disguise, because as hard as it was at the time, it allowed me to move out on my own and start Evolved and eventually meet Laurie and be where I am today.
That's awesome. It's a great story. So, and you kind of chatted about like, getting burnt out from doing WODs and all that stuff. I know, like, And this happened for me too, just like feeling like I wasn't getting the results that I wanted and like trying to do more, right? Just like, okay, I'm not getting the results, so I just need to continue to do more, and eventually burned out, eventually got injured. I know there's a lot of people who deal with that, especially I work with a lot of women. We have like type A personalities where it's like, go versus, okay, we need to like rest and recover. It's like, that's kind of a foreign concept for a lot of people. And it was for me until I understood the actual like benefits and necessity of that. Maybe we can talk a little bit about like the psychology of doing less versus doing more and how that has maybe changed your training or how you've worked with clients and maybe some of your clients' results.
Yeah, totally. I think to one of the points that you made in the very beginning of that, you said that you kept doing more to try and get like better results. And I think that that probably is the root of the problem of why people aren't getting the results with CrossFit and the body composition results that they want, because the pursuit of CrossFit is a skill, right? It's like somebody is sitting there and a basketball player, and they're just practicing foul shots over and over because they have to get better at shooting foul shots, or they're practicing 3-pointers, or they're practicing dribbling, or whatever it is. But they're able to practice these skills without incurring fatigue. When CrossFitters practice skills, which they have to do because they have to get better at them, they're also simultaneously doing a workout. So we're going to do like a 5-minute EMOM of muscle ups and a 5-minute EMOM of thrusters. And we're going to practice rope climbs and blah, 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 and all these things. And at the end of the day, you just have so many things that you have to be good at that there just isn't enough time in the day to be good at all of them. So what they're doing is they're creating all of this fatigue because of these skills that they have to be good at. And in the pursuit of body composition, the objective is to limit fatigue. Like literally the person that ends up with the best results is the person that recovers the best. There's kind of a reason that like the top bodybuilders are like laid back type B personalities, because they go to the gym, they smash it, and then they just like sit at home and read and eat food. They like don't move. They're like, let me get 0 steps and just like let muscle build, manifest muscle. Right. And then, you know, all of the also the negative cascade of effects that occurs from doing excessive cardiovascular activity, like cortisol rising and testosterone depleting and all of these things. So I don't even exactly remember what the precise nature of your question was. I think I just
No, you're good. No, I'm just wondering if like you've seen like the clients that you've worked with when you've maybe cut their training in half, like, or something like that. Like, have you seen better results, or like, how do you convince them that doing less will actually get you better results? Is kind of what I was going at.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good question, because it is hard. I mean, that's probably the hardest thing that we do, is trying to convince people to do less. So I hate the trust the process word. I actually really don't like it. I think it gets overused, and I'm like, don't trust the process. Like, let's prove to you about why this process works versus you having to trust it. But I guess even within the idea of proving that the process works, there probably is some inherent level of trust that the person has to take, because I can't prove to you that the process works in a week or in 2 weeks or maybe even a month. Right. So we'll trust the process. But I think that the first thing that we do is we make sure that people's rep quality is high, because the biggest thing of people coming from CrossFit to more of a physique pursuit is that they're still just focusing on moving weight from point A to point B as quickly as possible, versus what I prefer people to do is to utilize the eccentric of every movement, the lowering phase, and actually feel the intended muscle that you're targeting. Feel that muscle stretch, feel that muscle lengthen under tension, drive as much tension as you can into that muscle. And if you can take 3 seconds to slowly lower, let's use it as a back squat as an example, right? If you just sit down and stand up, it might be 1 second down and then a fight to get back up. Or you can take 3 seconds to go down, and you can actively brace against the resistance. You can fight your knees to travel forward, assuming we're looking at a quad dominant squat. You can fight your knees to travel forward over the toes. You can fight your pelvis to travel down into the ground, so that we're creating lengthening from the knee to the hip. And then at the bottom of that movement, continue to drive the knees forward, create as much of a deep stretch as you can. And then when you ascend up out of the squat, don't let your hips kick back. That's like the thing that almost everyone does, especially coming from CrossFit where time is the pursuit, right? So making sure that when you stand up, that your hips are staying under you, that your knees are staying forward, and that tension is driving through the quad. Of course, that would look very different if we're doing a glute dominant squat. But the point is that if you take that level of awareness and focus into the execution of all of the movements that you perform, that you're going to get so much out of each rep and each set that you actually won't be able to do as much work. Like you might in CrossFit have done a WOD that was like 50 front squats into 50 goblet squats into 50 air squats. And you did like 150 reps, and you're probably really sore the next day because that's miserable. And you put your quads through a lot of metabolite training. But with the way that I would be talking about approaching it is that each individual rep and each individual set is so focused and executed in such a proximity to failure within 0 to 3 reps from failure that in a matter of 5 or 6 sets for your quads, you should be limping around. And literally, we look at fatigue in session. And this is another way you can another point that I would use to kind of describe to someone how doing less is more is when you look at fatigue in session is usually defined by a drop in performance. But in CrossFit, it's very hard to assess whether you're receiving a drop in performance because you're just moving so quickly. Mm-hmm. In these workouts, if you hit back squats the way that I described and you get 10 reps on the first set and then you rest a couple minutes and go back, there's no way you're getting 10 reps in the exact same way with the exact same execution style again. And that's just representative of the fatigue that you're creating into that musculature.
Yeah, for sure. That makes complete sense. I think, and that's something that I've really been focusing on like the last year is just actually having intention with every single, rep and set. And I think it's something where, you hear the saying like, just go to the gym and get it done, right? That's like, you're doing good. Like just go get it done versus, actually having intention with everything that you're doing. And I think for me, like I found that, if I had this education, if I learned this, a while ago, I would be, I wouldn't have wasted a lot of time. Right. So I feel like, especially with a lot of the clients that I work with, it's just like explain to them that you don't have you can do more. You can do less and get better results because if you're focusing more so on quality over quantity, especially when it comes to body composition, I think that's something that like we were talking about, I feel like a lot of people kind of just pool together skill, performance, strength, body composition all into one. If you're not, especially if you're not educated on kind of what you're doing and what, working towards your specific goal and what you need to do to work towards that goal versus, okay, I'm going to the gym 3 times a week. I'm doing what I need to do. I should be getting the results I want, but you're not because maybe you're not, being specific to what the goal is. So I think, we chat a little bit about that. I think it's important to kind of understand the difference between building a skill and maybe even building strength versus if your goal is purely body composition, which a lot of people, that's their goal. Especially a lot of people listening to these podcasts is to change your body composition and, build some muscle, look quote unquote better in whatever, a bikini or naked, whatever you want to say. I think like that's just something that I've changed my mind about, or not changed my mind about, but learned a lot over the last year, just like being super intentional and just like not wasting time. And like you said, just focusing on every single rep. So how you have this saying on that, we were chatting about this off air, the own your rep movement. How did that come about?
I just it only started probably a week ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I was like, I saw it on Instagram and I was like, wait, this is really great.
So no, I constantly if the listeners can't already tell, I am very nerdy about movement, the biomechanics of movement. I'm definitely not a biomechanist. I don't have that education, but I find it very intriguing, and I'm very interested in learning more about movement and how to optimize movement for the purpose of hypertrophy. So throughout the process of, call it the last 5 years since I left CrossFit and moved back into the physique space. Sorry, 1 second. So I moved back in the physique space. And before CrossFit, I lifted mostly with strength pursuits. I mean, I would say I had a tangent desire to have hypertrophy, but I accomplished that less by being as nuanced with my movement as I am now, and more just by being like, okay, I should do some stuff for 3 to 5 reps and some stuff for 8 to 12 reps, I guess, but I didn't really push myself much out of my comfort zone as far as movement. And it was a lot of moving things from point A to point B. So like a perfect example of this is in college, I was less muscular than I am now. And I incline bench pressed the 110s for 6 to 8 reps or something like that. And they were full range of motion reps for sure. Now I can't do that. I use the hundreds for sets of 6 to 8 reps, but every rep I pause at the bottom. I have a 3-second eccentric. I squeeze through the chest the entire time on the ascent, and the movement quality is so much higher. So that's like the main thing that I found myself trying to instill in my clients and those people that are doing my general programs over the course of the last few years. And I always came up with all these different ways of saying it. And I wanted something simple because I wanted like just a hashtag, like own your rep, So one day, like a week or two ago, I was doing a set, and at the end of it, I was just like, man, I owned those reps, like in my head, I was just like, I really like got everything I could. I juiced every bit of squeeze out of those reps. And I feel really like positive about the execution of that set. And at the end, I was like, own your rep. I put it in my story and I was like, own your rep. And then like 10 people responded and they were like, hey, that's awesome. Own your rep. And like 3 people reposted it on their stories. And then you brought it up on the podcast today.
Yeah.
And I wrote, so before that, I wrote a post about it on Instagram. I think it's my most recent post since I really don't post much. And so that's really cool that you brought it up, because I would love if all of your listeners would do these really amazing, perfectly executed reps and then tag me with hashtag own your rep, and I'll totally repost it for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that, because it's just such a simple way to think about it too. Because if you do, focus so much on every single rep, and obviously there's some movements, I feel like, and this is something that I struggle with sometimes too, with, compound movements versus isolation movements and accessory movements. Sometimes like I find myself, especially with squats, like I do find myself getting a little bit too wrapped up in like feeling my quads work, if it's a quad focused squat, versus, an isolation movement where you really, really want to feel that. But that's something that, I struggle with, but I'm always, learning. But I think the own your rep kind of movement, like something that I'm always going to think about, especially like during those specific movements that I've been, struggling with. Cause I think it's so easy to go into the gym and just be like, all right, I'm just going to get it done. Right. Like I mentioned, versus actually paying attention to the quality and realizing that like you could get 10 times the results out of just focusing a little bit more and having a little bit more intention. So I think it's just super important for people to kind of think about. There was one other thing that I wanted to ask, and then I lost my train of thought.
It'll come back around. Yeah. It always does.
So let's transition a little bit to nutrition side of things. So we were talking a little bit off air. You kind of went through like a fasting period for a long period of time. Do you want to chat a little bit about that and kind of what you're like, because I know you transitioned out of that recently, or not so recently. Maybe I'm mixing up the time.
No, totally. Recently in the grand scheme of my life, for sure. I did intermittent fasting, progressively more severe intermittent fasting from 2012 up through 2019 and into early mid 2020. It started in 2012 in the CrossFit space because I really had a problem with food, I think, in retrospect would be the answer. I think I had this like massive hunger at night. And I think it was a product of what we were doing in the CrossFit gym, where we were up at 6 a.m. We were running classes all day. We were trying to build a business from scratch. And then by the time we finished, mopping and cleaning up at the end of the day, it was like 10 p.m. and we would go home and shower and make dinner and go to sleep at midnight, get like 6 hours sleep and do it all over again. So my circadian rhythm was all screwed up. My body's signals were all messed up. I was also at the time taking Adderall because I just needed energy. Mm-hmm. And so it was kind of just easier for me to take Adderall and drink coffee earlier in the day and then eat the majority of my food at night once kind of my life and my body and my mind were able to calm down a little bit. But that was like a really unhealthy way of implementing it, is kind of, what I realized over the course of time. Because if you're going to intermittent fast, saving calories is like the worst reason to actually do it. So by the time I got my shit together, I would say it was maybe a few years later, and I was off the Adderall. I was just drinking black coffee, and I was not training 3 times a day anymore. I was definitely doing things a little bit better. I even started to kind of, delve into some of the physique space at this point. And so what I really found I enjoyed about fasting during these times was that there was a real mental clarity that I felt helped me work better in the mornings. So I would get up, drink my black coffee, go for a short walk to stimulate the brain. And then I would come back and I would knock out almost all of my computer work between like 8 a.m. and noon. Like I wouldn't even think about it. Like at this time I would, I wasn't coaching as many classes at the gym. I arranged my day so that I could do this. And I would fast until maybe 12, 1 or 2, depending on the day. I would say if it was a non-workout day, I'd probably fast until 2 or 3 even, just try to push that out as long as I could. But if it was a workout day, I was usually pretty good about getting something in post-workout. I was still working out fasted at the time. So kind of just kept that up in almost the exact same way for the exact same reasons all the way through 2019. And then fast forward to 2020. And in June of 2020, I started my first cut since 2015 when I did it for the physique show with that awful experience. So in 2020, when I did it, I knew for sure that there were a lot of things I wanted to do differently. And I kind of alluded to it earlier when I said now, kind of with what we know about the evidence-based space and stuff like that, I would have done it differently. So this time, what I did was I didn't do any cardio. And this is exactly how I kind of recommend cutting to my clients these days too, at least as a starting point, is we have a calorie number and we have a step number, and we just continue with what we think will drop us about a pound a week or whatever. And my numbers at that time were 10,000 steps and 3,000 calories. And I dropped weight really quickly. As you always do in the beginning of a diet, especially guys, like bigger guys like myself, will drop 5 pounds of glycogen in like the first week. So it kind of skews the data. And you're like, wait, you lost 5 pounds in a week? And you're like, no, I didn't really lose 5 pounds. But literally in the first month, I lost 10 pounds. And I feel like that was about a pound a week because that first 5 or 6 pounds was glycogen. It dumped off real quick. And then I was about a pound a week. So 3,000 calories and 10,000 steps. And then after about 4 or 5 weeks, that stopped losing a pound a week. I noticed the scale kind of halt. So at that point, I dropped the calories to 2,700 and I upped my steps to 12,000, and it continued going just as I wanted it to. And then after about 4 or 5 more weeks, it stalled again. So I dropped my calories to 2,400 and upped my steps to 14,000, and it continued going again all the way until I got to 185, which was my goal. So I lost 20 pounds over 12 weeks, followed this simple format of just calories and steps. And it made the process really, really simple for me. The other thing that I did add in at that time is to stop intermittent fasting. But I still it's now a year later from that cut, and I still don't like eating food in the morning. So what I've kind of turned this thing into that seems to work really well in my life is that my first 2 or 3 consumptions of calories through the day are liquid. So I have like a kind of protein carb mix, then I work out, then I have another protein carb mix, then I may go for a walk and have like a third one, or I might just eat lunch. So either way, I'm like starting to consume calories more now at like 8 a.m. instead of at, noon, 1 or 2, but I still don't really eat any real food until like noon, 1 or 2.
Gotcha. Do you feel like you've been like at night? Because I know you mentioned your hunger used to be high at night. Do you feel like since you've stopped intermittent fasting, that's gone down?
Not really. To be honest, I mean, maybe a little bit. So, I mean, for sure, like a little bit, but not as much as you would expect given the consumption of calories earlier in the day. It actually, like, the hunger actually comes a little bit earlier now for me. So we're before, where like I wouldn't eat my first meal till 2 or 3, then I would have like a really big meal at 2 or 3, and then I'd have a really big meal at like 6 or 7, and then I would be like really hungry after that. But now it's like I have the liquid, and then I find myself like really, really hungry for my first meal of the day. Whereas before, like when I was fasting, I actually didn't really get hungry for the first meal. It was just kind of like something that I was like, okay, I've been fasting for a while, I should probably eat some food. But it's weird how like when you actually put calories in your body, it keeps your metabolism going a little bit more. And I think it begets the need for more food. So I find myself getting really hungry like middle of the day. And then what I do now is I just brush my teeth after dinner. So I still get really hungry at night, but I just don't acknowledge it. Like I'm just kind of like, it'll go away. And then I drink some water and it goes away. And so maybe to your point, maybe it is less because before like I kind of couldn't help but give into it. But I also think that maybe it wasn't just that I was giving into it as much as like I sort of needed it because I was so underfed prior in the day that those calories were like much more needed at that point. So maybe it was a little bit of both.
Yeah, for sure. I'm definitely like, I've always had a nighttime appetite. I don't know if it's like just habit or, well, it's definitely habit, but also like a genetic component because my mom would always eat at night, like always snacking. So I like grew up in a household where it was just like always, I mean, not to blame my mom or anything, but like I kind of like adopted that habit. And so I was always just kind of like, and a lot of people, you get home from work, you're relaxing on the couch, watching TV. It's just kind of like easy and enjoyable to eat. Right. So I do, like, I went through a period of time myself where I was like fasting hardcore, like every single day. And it was more so, to allow myself to have more calories at night. Right. But I found that, I started going down the fasting rabbit hole and had some side effects there. So now, I mean, I do think fasting is a great tool, but I think it can be definitely like overused and abused, especially from a lot of the women that I work with who are coming from like the low carb keto space and using intermittent fasting in that sense. I think it's a great tool, but you have to be very careful with how much you implement it. And like kind of going through, I like to cycle through it. So like, maybe I'll intermittent fast one day and then one day I'll have breakfast. And so I think it's a good tool, but again, you have to be careful. And I really like what you said about, with your recent cut, focusing more so on steps versus like actual formal cardio. I think just movement overall. And I feel like over the last few years, it's become more and more like people are starting to understand like, okay, just go walk, like go move. That's so beneficial, versus like spending hours on the treadmill or whatever. Have you, like with your clients, is that like, do you recommend any cardio at any point? Or you just kind of like hit this step goal, have your calories in check, you're good to go?
So I think the inherent problem with like cardio, call it middle intensity, steady state, or high intensity interval training, is that it confuses diagnostics. It makes it really difficult for a coach, or if you're uncoached for yourself, to make the proper adjustments to your nutrition and your cardio, because it's just not as easily trackable. Like, I guess I could see if you were running 20 minutes Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then it was like a jogging pace or something. And then you're just like, okay, I'm going to keep the same pace, but I'm going to add 5 minutes, and then I'm going to add 5 minutes or something like that. But I feel like then you kind of get into this like runaway train where at what point is that cardio just causing you fatigue that's then impacting your weight training sessions? So I think when you combine the fact that the diagnostics are much easier to interpret when you just have calories and steps to worry about. And then you also think about the fact that almost any cardio you do is going to cause a fatigue factor that you then have to account for. Whereas the fatigue factor of walking is way, way, way smaller. And then depending on the type of cardio you do, if it's running or biking or stair stepping, or I guess even elliptical, probably not elliptical as much, but any of the more leg dominant ones. I mean, I've seen in myself and I've seen in others a drastic impact on leg strength and leg size in a cut when people are doing cardio. But within myself and the people that I've coached, when people walk, they see no degradation of their leg training throughout the diet.
Yeah, absolutely. I've noticed that too. It's something like with my clients, we've definitely, use cardio as kind of that last piece of the cut, whether it's like towards the end. But I always recommend, I kind of go off of it with using heart rate. So like giving them a heart rate zone, right? Like, and just having your Apple Watch or Fitbit or whatever. And I generally always recommend, if you can do like an incline treadmill walk, and we'll kind of, start off, once we implement that, starting off like maybe twice a week for 20 minutes, see how that goes, and then increase like 5 minutes, but stay within a heart rate zone. And I always recommend incline walking as well, like you mentioned, because fatigue can definitely set in. This is something that I realized for myself too. Like during quarantine, when I didn't have access to a treadmill, I actually went through a cut myself. It was like, I think I started in March of 2020 through June, right when quarantine started. I was just getting into a cut, and I was like banking on having the incline treadmill for kind of the last half of it. And I didn't have that, but I did have a bike, like a stationary bike that I was able to actually borrow from my local CrossFit gym. It was an assault bike. And so I was doing just like cardio on that, and I was doing the same like heart rate, and my quads, like I was just so fatigued from that versus the incline treadmill walk, and it was definitely affecting like my strength, my training as well. But yeah, that's just something like walking is just so powerful, and especially if your goal is fat loss, because like you said, you can keep fatigue so much lower. And it's like people are like, oh, I'm just walking, like this isn't doing anything, like I'm not really sweating. But it is.
Yeah, you're just moving. I mean, it's super healthy, right? Like even the studies all show that, if you just walk and lift weights, like you're getting all of the cardiovascular benefits for your heart, cardiorespiratory benefits that you would be getting from like going for runs or going for bike rides or anything like that. I guess the one kind of argument I have from people sometimes when it comes to the steps is the time component. Just that if like for me in my situation, it's easy for me to get steps. So when I started my diet at 10,000 steps, I get like 7,000 or 8,000 a day without even going for a walk, just like chasing my kid around and driving him to school and walking from the car to the school and like going to the park and like all these different things that we do. So for me to go from like 10 to 14,000 is still like an extra 40 minutes of walking. Like I have to now intentionally go outside and walk for 40 minutes on top of like the other 10,000 steps of movement, which is like 2 hours of movement. Luckily for me, it's just easy movement. But if somebody's at 3,000 steps because they have a sedentary desk job and you're like, now go to 10,000 steps, and they're like, dude, I'm going to have to walk for an hour and a half. Like I don't have 90 minutes of my day to just walk, So in those cases, like we as coaches just have to be adaptable. But even there, like depending on how serious the athlete is, and how much they want to achieve their body composition goals, I would probably ask somebody to just eat less food before I would have them do cardio.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes sense. And like you said, I didn't really touch on this, but yeah, I have clients too, who do have sedentary jobs, and it's like, I can't get 10,000 steps in like a day. And I think that's where, having like little tweaks here and there. Like, for example, I had one client who we just upped her steps, and it was like, all right, once you get to the gym, like on your training days, just hop on the treadmill for an extra 5 to 10 minutes beforehand and extra 5 to 10 minutes afterhand, put it on incline, put on, a good speed, get in a heart rate zone, and you'll knock out a good amount of steps from just like the front and back end of that. And you're also going to get warm for your training and then also cool down after your training. So it kind of, kills two birds with one stone, or whatever you want to call it. So it's just kind of finding those things. Then also, like, for example, I'm standing up now, just like, you don't realize that, you know, standing versus sitting. So there's all these like little tweaks you can make, but I think it's super important to realize that like cardio is a tool, right? And if you don't use it strategically, your body adapts to it as well. So if you're looking to, you know, if fat loss is the goal, you have to use it strategically. You can't just like go right into a cut and be like, all right, I'm just going to like do 30 minutes of cardio every single day and hope for the best.
No, I mean, where do you go from there? Like, where do you go when now you're like 12 weeks in and you're like, I can't lose any more weight when I'm already doing 2 hours a day of cardio?
Yeah, exactly. It's just the wrong way to go about it, but it's all about education, right? Like I went through that myself. And once I, you know, learned and hired my own coach and got educated, it was like, okay, this makes sense.
Totally.
So last thing, because I know we're getting kind of almost on the hour.
Cool.
Last thing I wanted to ask you, so for quarantine training, because obviously I know, you know, you had to change your training around a little bit. You created your own home gym. Was there anything that you've learned, obviously, over the last year, like one specific thing that you kind of took away from your training in quarantine?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question. I think there's so many things that I took away from quarantine. It's hard to even boil it down
or
to
a few,
one thing.
whatever.
So I've always been a fan of single leg movements. Even in the CrossFit days, like we were probably one of the first CrossFit gyms that was having people do every week. We would have them do like Bulgarian split squats in some form in like 2013, 14, whatever. So I've been a huge fan of those. But once I got into like more pure physique training after CrossFit, for whatever reason, I just stopped doing them. I started doing leg presses and hack squats and heels elevated squats and leg extensions and a lot more of those things for my quad focus movements. And then when quarantine hit, the only thing I had at the beginning of quarantine was 4 sets of dumbbells, 20s, 50s, 75s, and 100s. So I was really, really lucky that I had the 100s because at least I could train legs hard, but I couldn't do like squats or deadlifts with the 100s. Like that wouldn't really accomplish much, but single leg squats, those were incredible. So quarantine, March 2020, I started split squatting again. And I put a post on my Instagram of a shot of my quads at the beginning before quarantine and then 6 months into quarantine. And the only thing I'd really been doing was just tons and tons of split squats and single leg RDLs and stuff like that. And the picture for sure, like angles do change things. My legs didn't grow 3 inches like the picture looks, but they did change significantly. And that leads into kind of one of the second things that I learned in quarantine, which was I really started putting that super, super deep focus of the own your rep movement into all of my reps. Not that I didn't have high movement quality prior, but I think until quarantine, I was still training with a bit of ego. So I was doing movements as best as I could while still having this notion in my brain that I had to be lifting the most weight possible or else I wasn't doing myself justice. And it's funny how when the amount of weight that you have is limited, how hard you can actually make something feel by just doing it slightly differently. You know, So doing a split squat, that's a glute dominant split squat where your shin is vertical in the front. I feel like I could lift like 1,000 pounds. Like I would never fail. Like I could do the 100-pound dumbbells for so many reps, but when I turn that split squat into a quad dominant squat and send the knee forward and the pelvis down and all those things we talked about in the beginning, those 100-pound dumbbells are so heavy. Like I almost like couldn't even do them in the beginning because it was putting such tension through that quad that I hadn't felt before. So I think realizing the power of the way that I execute movements and how much impact that has on the way that the muscle is being trained. It really is like you can make a really light or a moderate weight feel really, really heavy. So that was cool. And another thing that I learned was that you can split training up into AM, PM if it fits your lifestyle better. This is a thing I did for like 6+ months. And it was amazing. Like people look at it and they're like, dude, you train twice a day. Like, why would you do that? And I was like, well, look, I have a 90-minute session. I can do a 45-minute session in the morning, or a 45-minute session in the evening or afternoon or whatever. Or I could do one 90-minute session. I'm not doing two 90-minute sessions, right? So it's taking the same amount of volume, splitting it up evenly across the day. And of course, there's nuance in the execution of that, regarding, compound movements primarily in the morning, or more fatiguing movements in the morning, and then coming back for the isolation work later on, things like that, feeding between sessions. But that has been a huge thing too, because especially when we're all in quarantine and at home, it was a lot easier for me to find like a 30 to 45-minute window than it was for me to find like a 90-minute window. And a lot of my other clients have found the same.
Yeah, for sure. That's super cool. I even think about the AM, PM training. But yeah, split squats I feel like that's one movement that it's like the one movement that you hate it and you love it all at the same time. At least I feel that way. Those are always in my program in some fashion. And it's just like, I hate them, but then afterwards I'm just like, wow, those are awesome.
Yeah. You just get so blown up from them and sore like through the entire leg. I mean, nothing hits my adductors like the split squat. I can do all sorts of variety of like, the different sex machines or whatever, like any of the like hip adduction movements, and nothing makes them sore and targets them like a split squat does.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned too, like the execution of the movement, like we were talking about, like there's just so much, if you just focus on the intention and the quality, like you can get so much out of it. And that's something that I personally learned in quarantine as well. It's just like, just focusing and just being intentional with every single thing that I'm doing, and like realizing there's so many different ways to go about it to stimulate different things. And also, like you said, just like throwing your ego in the trash is just so powerful, especially when hypertrophy is your goal, because you don't necessarily need to be moving the most amount of weight, especially if you're doing it in a way that's not stimulating the muscle that you're trying to stimulate. And your obviously form and technique is just like trash. You're just doing more and getting less out of it is something that I've for sure learned over the last year.
Do you also see the same thing with like either yourself or with others regarding the forcing of progression for progressive overload versus kind of like letting it come to you and, understanding that you got stronger and that's why you can do more weight. You don't have to add weight so that you get stronger.
Yeah, that was like the last topic that I wanted to chat about, actually.
Okay.
So I'm glad you brought it up. But yeah, that's definitely something I learned. I was always kind of, at least before a year ago, right? I was always trying to just like every single week beat my logbook, like progressive overload. I have to like do it one more rep, or I have to do a little bit more weight like every single week. And then I realized that, especially as you get more advanced, like that's not necessarily the case. And obviously, like there's going to be some weeks when yes, you can do that. But I think I was for sure like compromising range of motion. I wasn't like it looked good on paper, but when I was actually like in the gym or, doing a movement, yeah, maybe I got one more rep, but was my range of motion the same as it was the week prior? So that's something that, again, just coming back to like being super intentional and actually like, not cheating myself by putting it in the logbook that, yeah, I got one more rep or I added a little weight, but like, did I actually progress? But yeah, that's definitely something that I've been paying more attention to, is like not necessarily, beating my logbook week to week, but like over the course of a few weeks, and also just paying more so attention to, like I go off of reps in reserve for myself and with my clients, paying more so attention to that, and actually like becoming like more advanced with that and realizing, okay, like this is truly 2 RIR versus, maybe a year ago I was like, this is 2 RIR, but it was actually like 4 RIR, right? So, and what have you found yourself in that regard with like progressive overload, and has your mind shift in any way?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that the reason I brought it up is because I think it relates very heavily to the ego conversation. So the perfect example that I always use with progressive overload, because for whatever reason, I don't see range of motion compromised as much as I see execution compromised. So the example I always use is the back squat, to go back to that again, where if we're doing a quad dominant back squat and we go down and we keep our hips under and we come up, and somebody does that perfectly, say at 135 for 10. And the last rep, they're keeping their hips under them, and it's a grinder because they're making sure that the quads are doing the work. So then the next week they do 140 and everything's good, whatever. At some point they get to a weight because of this desire to constantly add weight where they're still able to get 10 reps. But if you were to look at the video 4 weeks later from the video 4 weeks prior, in the first video, they're keeping their hips under them and they're driving through the quads through the middle. But in the last video, when they're hitting the same set of 10 reps, they get to that sticking point in the middle. And instead of fighting through it, they kick their hips back or their knees shoot back. The torso comes forward. And even if it's subtle, that little teeny subtle movement is shifting all of that tension out of your quads and into the hips and the glutes and the erectors. And so what I always tell people is that, like, if your goal is body composition, if your goal is hypertrophy and your goal is not to lift weight like a power lifter, because a power lifter doesn't care if their quads are doing the work. They just want to get the weight up. And we get trapped in that idea of like, we constantly need to do that. But if your goal is hypertrophy or body comp and you're letting your hips kick back and you're letting the tension shift out of your quads, then you might be doing more weight. That 155 pounds for 10 is more weight than the 135 you were doing for 10, but your quads don't think so. Your quads actually may have regressed because they weren't actually fighting through the hardest part of the rep. So I think that that's one really important way of kind of making sense of it. And then regarding kind of the idea of adding weight to the bar and the whole notion of like how you perceive the chicken and the egg of progressive overload, I think the best way I've found to describe it is that you increase weight because the weight you were using prior is too easy. And that's it. Like, you don't finish a set 1 week and it's like a really hard set at the end. And you're like, man, that was hard. I don't know how I'm going to do 5 more pounds next week. Like, if you have a hard set, then you do that shit the same weight the next week. And you make sure that it wasn't a lie. Like, preparedness is one thing that we know differs on a day-to-day basis. So one day you might go in and do 100 pounds for 10 with 2 RIR. And then the next week you come in and do 100 pounds for 9 and you're like, oh, this is 2 RIR. So then do you go and you do the 10th rep because you're like, well, I got 10 last week, so I have to do 10 this week. But now you're doing 10 and it's 1 RIR. You didn't get stronger. You matched your reps, but you actually got weaker. So you need to diagnose your training, diagnose your result. Do you need a deload? Are you doing too much volume? Are you not doing enough volume? Is your frequency too high? Is your frequency too low? Like, all of these different things, right? Or did I sleep enough? Did I not sleep enough? Did I eat too many calories? Or did I eat enough calories?
Yeah.
Like, all of these different questions you have to ask yourself when you don't make progress. But if you just stick to the concept of, I increase weight when the weight I'm lifting is too easy. It's super simple.
Yeah.
It's too easy. Add weight. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I think it's just like finding that balance too. Like, you want to push yourself, and I think it's hard. Like, you know, the RIR scale, I think, is super beneficial and I use it with all my clients, but it's one of those things that you just constantly need to check in with yourself, like every single day, because like you said, things change. Like, maybe you got a crappy night of sleep and you're doing the same workout you did last week. Like, there's so much variable that goes on day to day. So I think, yeah, there's like a fine line and just kind of like finding that balance. And it's not always going to be perfect. Like, some days are going to be way harder than others and vice versa. So yeah, I love it.
Do you, regarding kind of the question of assessment of like, you know, are we really getting stronger? Because RIR can be ambiguous. Do you utilize like AMRAP testing or max reps testing or something like that at the end of a mesocycle or at any point throughout?
I don't personally, I haven't done that. It's something that I've thought about. But really, like with my personal clients, if they're questioning something like that, if they're questioning their RIR or their technique, I just have them like shoot me form videos and kind of like can assess based off of their perceived, like how I perceive their effort. And then also just like like you said, looking at their technique and their form. That's probably the main way that I go about it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I don't know why I always find myself like leaning towards this kind of like at the end of a mesocycle, right before deload week, throwing a couple movements into like okay, use the same weight you were using throughout the mesocycle and now take it to technical failure, like take it to zero RIR or whatever. And then that kind of gives me an idea of whether they're bullshitting their RIRs. And it also gives them an idea of whether they are. And I think that it's knowledge that they can then take into the next mesocycle after deload and maybe have a slightly better idea or a better grasp on how to implement the RIR.
Yeah, I like that. It's definitely something that I should probably be doing.
I mean, I know coaches that don't do it too. So like the guy that coached me didn't use it. So, I mean, there are very, very, very well-respected coaches out there. It's really just a preference thing.
Yeah.
But for me, like as somebody that loves diagnostics and analytics, like I personally know that I have a tough time ending a mesocycle without feeling like if I still did a movement and I was at 1 to 2 RIR, I would have a tough time being like, okay, time to deload. Like I kind of feel like I'm like, okay, I'm at 1 to 2 RIR here. And then I'm like, okay, let's do one more week, one more microcycle, push some of these movements that I've been kind of on the fence about, push these to failure, see what I'm capable of. Now I know the fatigue is really high because I went to failure, and now I'll deload, flush all that out and start back up again. So.
No, I love that. Definitely something that I'm going to incorporate for sure. I definitely encourage the last week before deload to always be, obviously the hardest week in terms of RIR, right before you have a rest coming up and kind of the progression throughout, the weeks. So yeah. Awesome. All right. I feel like, we've been a little bit over an hour. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Do you want to tell our listeners where they can find you? Also, you have your own podcast, which I absolutely love. So tell us a little bit about that. Tell us about your programs and where we can find you.
Cool. Thank you so much. Podcast is Eat, Train, Prosper. It's with my buddy Aaron Straker. I know he's been on your podcast before. And Aaron and I started this because we both had a desire to kind of go deep and talk about a lot of the nuance of training that we kind of delved into today regarding like some of the biomechanics of movement and the, nutrition during cutting and all these things that we talked about that were so much fun are the things that we talk about on our podcast as well. So check that out on all the major providers. I think we have 14 episodes now. And you can find me on Instagram at Bryan Boorstein, or if you type in Evolved Training Systems, you'll find me as well. And you can check out evolvedtrainingsystems.com or paragontrainingmethods.com for all of the programs.
Sweet. I will link all of those in the show notes, and definitely check out Eat, Train, Prosper. The first 2 episodes you guys did, you did like an upper body episode and then a lower body episode. Those are like money. Like if you are listening to this, go listen to those. Cause I just took so much out of them. And if you're, questioning execution or you just want a little bit more kind of dive into different cues and things like that, I think those episodes are amazing. So
Episode 3, part 1 and part 2 is exercise execution or something like that. Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, for sure. I'll link those in the show notes. Well, this is awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
For sure. You too.
Thanks.